Good evening, everyone. We begin the readout tonight in week 4 of Russia's unprovoked war on Ukraine. And while the Ukrainian people continue to courageously resist, with Russian troops mostly stalled in their ground advances, it's become increasingly clear that Vladimir Putin has no qualms when it comes to slaughtering civilians. The U.S. State Department confirmed today that a U.S. citizen in the country for his partner's medical treatment was killed in an assault on civilians while waiting in a bread line in Chernihiv, a city that's directly on the path from Belarus to Kyiv. Russia continues to attack the Ukrainian capital, and it appears their strategy is to put the city under siege. Here's a dispatch from my colleague Richard Engel.
Russia has now clearly resorted to siege warfare. It has surrounded the city of Mariupol, and here in Kyiv, it seems that Russia wants to starve people out. This was one of the country's biggest food storage facilities, and it's completely destroyed.
It's a strategy that's been underway in the key port city of Mariupol, where I will warn you the images that you're about to see from a local hospital this week are graphic. Mariupol has been under siege for 16 days, with the Ukrainian government saying the situation is critical. 80% of housing has been destroyed and food is scarce. Hospital workers are doing their best to protect babies in incubators from shelling. Here's a Mariupol resident speaking Russian, describing the horrific situation as genocide.
Помогите! Это город жилой, жилые дома, СОС. Помогите Мариуполю! Убивают детей, женщин, больницы переполнены. Мы все здесь на что? Это ж я не могу понять, это геноцид?
Up to 1,000 people had been sheltering at a Mariupol drama theater, trying to avoid the deadly bombardment. And despite signs that read children in Russian at the back and in the front of the theater, Russia bombed it anyway. Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska, who sits on the Intelligence Committee, said this morning there's evidence that the Russians celebrated the fact that they were trying to kill children.
We know from some back-channel stuff that some encrypted apps that a lot of Russian military were using afterwards, they were cheering the fact that they had killed children. This wasn't some accidental bombing.
Thankfully, the bomb shelter survived the hit, but we don't yet know how many might have lost their lives in the attacks. Residents were able to leave the besieged city today, many heading to the city of Zaporizhia, where Ukrainian musician Slava Vakarchuk posted a video of children at a hospital, which NBC has not independently verified. Vakarchuk said they were trying to get away from the Russian world, but the Russian army went after them, lost legs, torn internal organs. These are real signs of Russian love. The Ukrainian government said today that at least 108 children have died and more than 120 have been injured from the war so far. Meanwhile, Russia is trying to gaslight the entire world about what's happening in Ukraine. This morning, the spokeswoman for the Kremlin's Ministry of Foreign Affairs claimed that the atrocities that Russia is committing are really just fake videos staged by NATO. Late today, Russia's ambassador to the UN echoed that propaganda, claiming the West is engaged in a hyped campaign of lies and disinformation. Meanwhile, in his desperation, Putin is lashing out, threatening to cleanse Russia of pro-Western traitors and scum. It is clear that he's been humiliated on the battlefield, where morale is low, and he's reportedly lost 4 generals so far. One of those generals was killed after Ukrainian forces intercepted his phone call on an unsecure phone, geolocated it, and attacked his location, according to the New York Times. The problem is Putin will only stop when he realizes the war is unwinnable, and so far, he appears to be doubling down. Joining me now is NBC News correspondent Cal Perry in Lviv. Cal, give us the latest on what you know of where you are and elsewhere in Ukraine.
So, look, I think the story of the last 24 hours, as you saw in Richard's report, is we're now seeing the direct targeting of civilian infrastructures. This is how civilian populations survive, and we're seeing these things be taken out. So in Kharkiv, for example, in the northern part of the country, a marketplace, a food market, directly targeted, we believe, by Grad rockets. There is an extensive fire there. This, again, was one of the last places people could go and get food. You're seeing that video there. In Chernihiv, and you talked about this, a bread line. At least 10 people, quote, gunned down, and that according to the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv. Again, waiting in line for bread. In the city of Kyiv, you have that grain factory, the largest supply of food for the city that has been directly targeted. So it seems clear that the strategy here that the Russians are now employing is not just to indiscriminately target civilians or directly target them as they leave these areas, as we reported on yesterday, but now to target the things that sustain life in these cities, to try to break the back of these civilian populations. What is most fascinating about this, and how you finished your lead in, is the Russians seem to be taking incredible heavy casualties on the military front. We heard in the past hour or so from the deputy prime minister, who said that she is working with the Red Cross, and they're talking about eventually transferring 14,000 dead Russian soldiers back to Russia. We can't independently verify that that number is accurate, except to say that in the last 30 minutes, we heard from President Zelensky, who has posted a new address to the nation, in which he says in that address, we did not want, nor did we expect, the bodies of some 13,000 Russian soldiers. Again, we cannot independently verify these numbers, but we are now hearing from officials here on the ground in Ukraine, government officials, that those dead Russian soldiers could number in this upwards of 10,000. It's maybe an indication that these two things are connected, that Russian troops, Russian army, and the officials and the generals who are now using these unsecured lines are not making the military gains in the speed in which they should. And so what they are doing is they are punishing the civilian population, and you saw it there in Mariupol. And it should be mentioned again, in that city, there are Russian soldiers who have put themselves in the main hospital of that city, who are using patients, wounded civilians, as human shields. It is a desperation that we have seen from the Russian army in places like Syria, in places like Grozny, but we are now seeing it play out across these eastern cities in Ukraine, where the situation is becoming so desperate that you have people who can't go above ground for food anymore out of fear of shells and because, Joy, there's no more food.
Yeah. Cal, if I can just quickly ask you, I mean, you've been a correspondent that's covered conflicts and covered, these kinds of situations before. I just wonder if it surprises you how sort of third rate the Russian army has turned out to be. This sounds like a ragtag army that doesn't have a hell of a lot of combat experience, let alone the kind of experience that could allow them, they could lay waste to the capital, but it doesn't seem like the kind of army that could take and hold it.
Yeah, so a few things absolutely have shocked me. One, the body of Russian soldiers in the streets of Kharkiv. So that tells us that Russia doesn't even control the battle space on the ground in the places that they're invading. I have never seen a modern army leave the bodies of soldiers behind. It is something the U.S. Army has as part of their code, as part of the mantra in some of these units. We don't leave anybody behind. I've never seen that in a conflict where the invading army is either pushed away so hard or so disorganized that they don't control it. The Turkish drones, we talked so long about this 40-mile convoy outside of Kyiv, right, of these armored vehicles that had basically been stalled, some of them stuck in the mud, stuck in the cold, running out of fuel. Turkish drones have been strafing these armored convoys. They've been killing a high number of Russian soldiers. These are very basic drones that should be able to be shot out or jammed. So there is an incompetence that the Russian army is showing very quickly. It is scaring people here, this idea that Putin is being pushed into a corner, right? What could he do? How big could the bombs get? Could he bomb here? That's a fear, but your point is absolutely right, Joy. The army has not done what it thought it would do.
Yeah, it's so much for them being a superpower. Cal Perry, thank you very much. Appreciate you. I'm joined now by Tom Nichols, contributing writer at The Atlantic, and Charles Carithers, former staffer for the House Homeland Security Committee, advising Chairman Benny Thompson, who is now principal of the consulting firm Cornerstone Government Affairs. Tom, I have to ask you the same question. I mean, you teach students of war. You teach our war makers. I have been, frankly, stunned. I mean, the idea that there were sort of two big superpowers, the United States and Russia, was predicated on the idea that Russia had a lethal army. What this sounds like is sort of a terrorist gang that can inflict a lot of damage and kill a lot of people. But the stories of, their army having to loot because they don't have enough food to supply themselves, having to abandon their vehicles because they don't have enough fuel. This sounds like a ragtag third-rate army. Are you surprised by their lack of efficiency and the lack of efficiency with which this horrific invasion has been undertaken?
My expectations were low, and the Russian army managed to get under them. Even the Soviet military at its height had discipline problems, had coordination and logistical problems, because these are not soldiers that are trained to think on their feet. I mean, we're used to thinking about militaries like the U.S. and modern European militaries, where they prize things like initiative and leadership, whereas the Russian military has always prized obedience and procedure. And they're paying for it now. I mean, they're poorly trained. Their officers don't care about them. They're the equivalent of their non-commissioned officer corps is often brutal and cruel to their own recruits and conscripts. And, you know, when you throw a bunch of folks who've been trained with that kind of brutality into a situation where they have to fight for their lives in a war they don't want, this is what you're going to get. There is no other play other than to just unload all of your ammunition, flatten everything, and then run when you're being defeated.